The Crypt Thing is a skeletal, hooded being that is normally depicted as sitting on a throne or chair of some kind. It never leaves its lair and does not attack if undisturbed. Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today, as voted by you in our Twitter poll, we're going to be delving into the mystery of the Crypt Thing. Okay, so in the Fiend Folio for AD&D 1st edition, the Crypt Thing is a solitary undead, always encountered wearing a brown robe. It never leaves its throne or lair, and in terms of raw power, although it's not a pushover, it's not exactly going to be throwing down with high-level heroes. The main strength of the Crypt Thing is it has an unfailing ability to cast an improved form of teleportation on those who would seek to do it harm. Those targeted have to make a save, and if they fail, they're teleported to a random place in the dungeon as determined by a D percentile table. The table in Fiend Folio reads as follows, so it's 1 to 20, you go 100 to 1,000 foot north, 21 to 40, same distance but south, 41 to 60, same distance but east, 61 to 80, same distance but west, 81 to 90, you go a dungeon level up, 91 to 100, you go a dungeon level down. Each person is teleported to a random place individually, instantly splitting up the party, and presumably the Crypt Thing relies on that fact to ensure that they sort of fall prey individually to foes they might have defeated as a group in the dungeon. Anyone who succeeds on their save can attack the Crypt Thing, but will need magical weapons to do so. The Fiend Folio also describes an aberrant Crypt Thing which, rather than teleporting people, paralyses them and turns them invisible, no doubt leaving their foes thinking that their companions have been disintegrated, or something along those lines. The Crypt Thing doesn't attack these people, but seems to derive pleasure from sowing discord and confusion amongst its foes. Now, love, you've got the AD&D 2nd Ed Monster Manual there, so what does it say about the Crypt Thing in that?
Again, it has the teleportation power. The actual description is fairly similar.
Yeah.
We've got the teleportation power, but not the paralysis and turning invisible thing. They can only be hit by magical weapons.
Yeah.
We've also got this sidebar, which I thought was quite interesting, it being in 2nd Ed and it definitely not being in the later editions.
Yeah.
Which says that the spell enables the caster to cause a single dead body to animate and assume the status of a Crypt Thing. The necromancy element out and proud in the 80s D&D.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the first one its sort of origins are left to a mystery, but specifically here in AD&D it tells you that there's two types of Crypt Things. There's one which is ancestral, which sort of occurs naturally, and the other, as you said, love, created by a wizard or a cleric of at least 14th level, and they've got a little box out with that spell in that you're talking about.
It's quite an interesting little sidebar to have like details on how to create the magical creature. I can see why it's been left out later, because necromancy, satanic panic. Anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things I like about the ecology is it also says that like the powdered like bone marrow of the Crypt Thing can be used to create lots of different magic items like potions of undead control, pipes of haunting and stuff like that.
Yeah, this is another thing that you see a lot in the 2nd Ed book, and I think it was mostly just filler in the 2nd Ed book. But a lot of it's a really interesting little read. Yeah,
I think you're probably right. I mean, as we've said in previous versions of this, each monster in the AD&D 2nd Ed Monster Manual has a single page A4-ish spread. So I think on quite a few of them, especially with the Crypt Thing, where basically it's an undead that can teleport things, they had to like fill up some of that space. So they added in these cool extra things, which I think ironically are often like the most interesting bits of it.
Now, another thing that I noticed that in here is part of the description. It encourages the GM to use their own judgment as to where players are teleported to.
Okay.
And it then says, particularly clever Crypt Things have been known to transport victims several hundred feet into the air or atop a vast chasm, leaving them to fall to their death. Now, I can see that resulting in a lot of TPKs for a lot of 14-year-olds who then got put off the game. Just from the GM reading that and taking it far too literally.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, because the way I'd sort of read it in the original Fiend folio, I mean, this might just be me, but based on the random table, is I just assumed that the Crypt Thing didn't really have that much control over where it teleported people. I just thought it went like Shazam and then forgot about you and it just sent you somewhere random. Whereas that seems to suggest it's got more control, which makes sense because you have a certain amount of control when you cast the teleport spell. But like you say, I can see, I mean, if you can just teleport someone like 1,000 foot straight up in the air and watch them drop to their deaths, you know, that makes you pretty much invincible.
Whereas that little detail, if your bard has found out that there's a crypt thing in the dungeon that you're going to, that's a really handy little detail to give him and to like underline how dangerous that teleportation power could be without actually having to use it on them in that way.
I'll tell you one thing that I think would be quite cool as well, ways you could perhaps encounter them sort of like indirectly, is I quite like the idea of like you just sort of like sat in a village like nearby a dungeon or that's like on top of a dungeon or whatever, and all of a sudden like this other adventurer just like randomly like drops out of the air like into the middle of like your camp, or like you're eating your provisions or whatever around your campfire, or maybe you're buying something at like the village market and all of a sudden this adventurer's like into the ground, and he's a member of some previous hapless party who's like met this Crypt Thing, he's failed his save in Shazam, he doesn't know what happens to his people, and that could be a great hook into it. Like he's, oh, we've got to go back and rescue my friends, and it's also more interesting than just like the wise old like wizard turns up and is like, I need you to venture into the dungeon.
So, do we want to look at Third Ed?
Yeah, and in Third Ed, Crypt Things didn't appear until the release of the 3rd edition Fiend folio, which is essentially a monster book with some extra bits and pieces thrown in that, besides being a monster book, didn't really have any ties to the original Fiend folio. The artwork for this I particularly like. Shows you like the hunched over rotting coward skeleton sat on a large sort of stone throne, and I was going to say that's one of the differences in the artwork in the AD&D monster manual, because I believe that's the only depiction that just shows it stood up. In all the other depictions I've seen anywhere, it's always been sat down, and even the miniatures of the Crypt Thing have it sat on like a sort of stone chair or like a throne or something similar.
Well, it is that classic image, isn't it, of the players going into the dungeon and there's a skeleton in the throne, and then they do something dodgy and it moves.
That's it. I don't know why that was particularly wrapped up in the Crypt Thing, or whether so I've not found it specifically stated anywhere they can't leave their chairs, although it says that they never leave their lair. But I've always sort of like, going back years from when I just sort of knew them from miniatures and from the old raffles, I always thought of them as sat on their throne. So I don't know whether it was captured on a miniature and that just sort of got carried forward in sort of like lore or whatever. But anyway, in Third Ed, as tended to be the way with that system, it gets a load of skills and it gets some feats allowing it to deflect arrows, it gets improved initiative, it gets a weapon focus like its claws, so it's becoming more aggressive now. The initial one was just like a sort of Shazam, I've teleported you, and it didn't attack, whereas from sort of the monster manual version through 3rd edition it becomes more aggressive and the teleport's just like its opening gambit. I do note that the teleportation ability has been limited to once per day in 3rd edition. I don't think it was in previous editions.
It doesn't suggest that the GM uses their judgment. The rules are very specific.
Yeah, quite. And also, in previous versions, the monster had been like 100% immune to clerical turning. Like, you just couldn't turn it because it was rationed out that the magic that summoned it, that allowed it to do the teleportation, was so strong that, like, you couldn't turn it. However, in 3rd edition, they're no longer 100% immune to being turned, but they do count as having 4 more hit dice for those purposes. So they've definitely put some limits on the various powers and abilities it has, and I think potentially, as you were saying earlier, love, that's just to stop it becoming this like frustrating like insta kill monster that can just like Shazam you into a chasm or like up into the air or whatever.
So was it in 4th Ed or 5th Ed?
Well, I've had a look and I've not actually been able to find any official mentions of the Crypt Thing in 4th edition, not even in the Open Grave Secrets of the Undead sort of monstery book that they did, which I've got a copy of, which I thought, oh, it's bound to be a goer for that. It's a famous type of undead. But no. However, there is a homebrew version on the D&D wiki. We'll put a link in the description of this episode. But that version of the Crypt Thing, like I say, it's homebrew, it's not official. But that seems to be based bizarrely on the aberrant Crypt Thing from the Second Ed Monster Manual. It doesn't have the teleport ability, but as a minor action, like a recharge of 6, it can cause a target to be stunned, blinded and deafened and turned invisible. So again, that's basically like, it can just be like... and then turn to your fellows, it can be like, I've just disintegrated your mate. And until it wears off, you have no idea it's not telling the truth. Because as far as you're concerned, it points at your fellow, they disappear, they're gone. So, again, the person who created that seems to have done away with the teleportation ability, which again is understandable. I can understand why they don't want to have people slogging their way through a dungeon just to suddenly have this monster be like, and teleport you away again. In terms of 5th edition, as of yet, the Crypt Thing doesn't seem to have made an appearance in the current version of D&D, and I've had a look at all the books I've got. Although I've not got a vast array of 5th edition books, so if anyone out there knows different, feel free to drop us a line and let us know. Okay, so chatting a little about the Crypt Thing, I was going to say, for me, it seems that originally it was designed as an inconvenience to the party, designed to split them up, force them to confront different sections of the dungeon on their own. So you might have smashed your way through a load of orcs on your way there, big party of adventurers, happy days. However, you suddenly get teleported to that same part of the dungeon and you're only the mage and there's no one else or whatever, it's suddenly a lot more difficult. And I agree it could be very frustrating, but I could also see if it was played right and, a bit sort of sensitively, it could be quite a scary thing, because it's that whole fear of isolation, isn't it? Because all you know is suddenly you're in a different part of the dungeon. Your character doesn't know what's happened to your friends. Are they alive? Are they dead? Or has any time passed? Are you even in the same dungeon? I mean, if it's a fairly sort of nondescript part of the dungeon, you might be anywhere, really. Or like you say, if you just get teleported to a big cave, that could be in any part of the dungeon. You might even be in a bit you've not explored before. And I could see that it could be you could make a claim for it being used to have players explore areas of the dungeons they otherwise might have just bypassed or explored. But I think it was clearly made for sort of mega dungeon, big dungeon use. Because let's face it, given those distances on that teleport table, if you're in a tiny dungeon with a little tomb or whatever, it's not going to have 16 levels or 1,000+ foot of dungeon for you to be teleported into.
Yeah, it strikes me as something that could be sort of, for a mid-level party, quite an interesting villain to sort of find out about.
Yeah.
And you don't need a big dungeon in front of it. You just need a couple of false starts. So yeah, there's this tomb, there's a crypt thing in it.
Yeah.
We need to go and retrieve the MacGuffin from the wizard who's buried there, who summoned the crypt thing to protect him.
Yeah.
And you've got to go and find out, how can we, please the protector of this tomb or otherwise overcome it in order to retrieve the MacGuffin, while bypassing this teleport ability, because every time you get near, it just zaps you back out of the dungeon and you're stuck in the village again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a fun little thing. And like I say, the sort of undead guardian of some MacGuffin that you've got to get is a tale as old as time. We all know that trope. But I think with the Crypt Thing, you could potentially, ironically, give it some new life. Because it's not a monster you're going to use every day. Because I think if you used it more than a few times, it would just get annoying. Can you imagine if you had a game and you defeated your Crypt Thing, you went to the next dungeon and there was another Crypt Thing and you're all getting teleported everywhere again? I think that would start to get very annoying unless you're playing a game where you were deliberately playing it for laughs. But I could see sort of used sparingly every now and again. Like I say, it's a quirky sort of interesting like type of undead because it doesn't have the standard powers of the undead. It's not going to level drain you. It's not going to like turn you into another crypt thing. It's not going to do anything of that. The only power it's really got is Shazam you somewhere different. So yeah, I think it could be interesting if sort of used sparingly. And I mean, we can see looking at as they've sort of, I suppose, sort of limited it as they've gone on with various editions. I suspect that's due to people like using them in games and getting frustrated with being teleported everywhere to the point where they've sort of said, oh, well, we'll make it like it can do it once a day, or we'll make it a bit easier to pass the saves or something like that. But as you were saying, I could see that the way I would suggest using it is maybe sort of telegraph the fact there's a crypt thing there right from the start, like we were talking about earlier, the guy falling out of the sky into the village marketplace. So from the get, don't have it as a big surprise from the get-go. Just let them know there's a crypt thing there, because I think the annoyance factor would be, all right, we're going through a dungeon, we're coming up to the main boss, we're looking forward to a big fight. Oh, I've been teleported. Whereas if the players sorry, go ahead.
That's why I'm saying bypass that whole big dungeon bit, because honestly, how much of a dungeon is there going to be in front of you, crypt thing? Would you not put something like that front and centre to get rid of things like invading orcs?
Yeah, quite possibly.
It's a tomb guardian, and it's there to make sure that you don't need any other protection on your tomb. Why would you bother to then put your tomb like down at the bottom of a dirty cave?
Well, like I say, I mean, I'd go for the idea of telegraphing the fact there's a crypt thing in there right from the very start. So then it becomes less of a sort of jump scare, like surprise as the crypt thing. And as you were suggesting earlier, it becomes more about, all right, we know there's a crypt thing in there. We know because this guy fell out of the sky and he was like, oh, I've been teleported. We know that's what's going to happen potentially when we meet it. Then it becomes more of a sort of, like a sort of, almost like a mystery where like you're, okay, right, so we know this thing's there. We know we need to get past it. We know at least a couple of its powers. Now we need to find out a way we can get around it. And that might just be the case of going like, oh, right, okay, if it's doing teleport, we'll probably get some sort of save or whatever. Can we get any magic items or anything that's going to like stack those saving throws in our favour? And you might just rush it with like brute force and be like, let's tog up on all the magic items, let's rush it. Hopefully enough of us will pass our saves that we can like give it 6 of the king's best or whatever. So you could do it like that, or you could look at like you were saying, other ways. Like, this thing's obviously intelligent because it's described in all of the editions of D&D as like doing these things to sow discord, and because it enjoys the sort of chaos it strews around. So it's not unintelligent, because otherwise it'd have no appreciation of that. So if it's intelligent, can it be reasoned with? Does it want anything? Could you maybe bribe it? Could you maybe find out exactly what it was set there to guard? Because if it was set there to like guard the remnants of like an ancient king, for example, maybe if you're like, oh, actually, all we want is that like tapestry on the wall, and we're prepared to give you this for it, maybe it'll let you pass.
Or better still, if we get the magic MacGuffin, we can continue the legacy of the wizard that's guarded here.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, although it's obviously portrayed as like some form of intelligence, presumably it's bound to guard this place. It doesn't just get up and leave and forget about it. So presumably the spell that creates it sort of binds it to this duty, has like particular limits and particular sort of requirements. So like when you resurrect the skeleton or whatever and you're like, right, patrol this corridor, you give it clear orders. I imagine that when this thing is created, it's given like a clear mandate. You are here to guard this against intruders in this manner. So you could also portray like, how happy is the crypt thing with like just being stuck on this throne for like hundreds of years, like guarding the body of this king or whatever, because it's intelligent. Maybe it gets a bit bored after a few hundred years. Perhaps that's why it enjoys like teleporting people back and creating all this thing. Maybe it's just like, I've been sat down here, no one's come along for like 300 years. Away come these like chump adventurers who are like coming in to like steal this shiz in here. I'm going to amuse myself, because I'm sorely wanting for amusement, by teleporting them about all over the place or making them think they've disintegrated people. So perhaps if it craves amusement, and it obviously does as portrayed in the earlier editions, perhaps if you offer to provide it some alternate form of amusement in return for being allowed to go and get the MacGuffin or whatever you're after, maybe it'll agree to it. I mean, what if you said to it, like, oh, if you let us know, let's take this like minor little trinket, we'll arrange for like the next year, like every month, we'll send like some people down here, because we've cleared the dungeon out, we'll send some people down here and you can like teleport them about.
If that's what you're into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that's the thing that like a particularly sort of like good aligned in inverted commas like party would do, but that's just a random example. Perhaps it has all the wants and needs that you could pander to get your hands on that sweet MacGuffin afterwards. Okay, so that's been our episode about the Crypt Thing. Thank you very much if you voted in the Twitter poll, and if you're listening to this, we hope you've enjoyed the episode. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, keep gaming. If you want to get in touch with us, you can leave a message for us using SpeakPipe. There'll be a link in the description below. Or you can send us an email to oddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Turns them individual.